Hello, Karima.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It was lovely to get to see your talk just now. One of the things you talked about, Karima, was leading multiple ERGs, and that's something that I think you call them ARGs. Is that right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. And so that's something that we've been seeing, I think, more of in the research on communities and on ERGs because folks have so many overlapping identities that are represented in a lot of these groups. And so I was just interested in what that experience has been like for you, kind of navigating, and how much overlap there is between the work that's happening in those ERGs.
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult, and I could sit here and talk about intersectionality for a really long time. But I mean, originally I joined the two different ARGs because, I had identity matches. I'm a disabled, ethnically diverse individual. So, it kind of made sense to join the race ARG and the diversibility ARG. It's definitely interesting because there's a lot of kind of boxes, I guess, that I don't fit into in both spaces. Which is why I kind of wanted to take lead of in within these communities and take that position so that I can create the comfortability for people to bring their whole selves, not just that section of their identity that fits into their ARG. So it's definitely difficult and it's hard work because there's so many different overlapping identities. Um, but I think it's all about creating that environment where people can step forward and say, you know what, why don't we do this? Why don't we talk about this? And so we've started to do a bit more on intersectionality and a bit more teamwork between our ARGs. So we're planning an event which is a partnership of the Race ARG and the Diversibility ARG, all about navigating the healthcare system as Black people. So like there are so many different things that we can do and so many different spaces to open up. And it's just about creating that space so that people feel that they can come forward and say, you know what, why don't we do this crossover or that crossover?
I love that. And I love to hear about the fact that you're partnering together with the different groups so that folks can have these opportunities to kind of, be in multiple spaces at once. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that you have helped to create that kind of environment where people feel safe, especially at work? I found that it can be really difficult to create those kind of safe spaces where people feel like they can really talk about these difficult subjects. So if you have any tips, I'm sure the group would be excited to hear those.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I do it is I always put myself in the most uncomfortable position so that people can see that it's okay. And it's always, when you're like in a silent room and you're waiting for the first person to talk and then everyone else feels like they can talk. It's kind of like that. So whenever like there is a situation, I will like very openly talk, for example, in our diversibility group about my struggles as a disabled woman navigating the healthcare system because my experiences of it are very different from, a white individual's experience of navigating the healthcare system. So I'll always use my personal stories to try and be vulnerable and then lend that comfortability to people so that they can feel comfortable and vulnerable as well. And like there's only so much you can do as one individual, but like trying to like foster an environment of openness and, trust. I think trust is one of the biggest things whenever I run training sessions or talk to anybody. I always make sure that I can create an environment of trust first, and then people feel a lot more open to bring that stuff to the table.
Excellent. That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing. And we do have a question from Ken. So, Ken is talking about this sort of journey from being an unstructured community like an ERG and trying to get that a little bit more formalized. Do you have any experience and along parts of that journey for formalizing a community at work?
I mean, I haven't had the experience of formalizing a community, so I joined Mars 18 months ago, and they were already established ARGs with excellent leadership and amazing membership. I would say it depends on the company as well. So I would probably seek to find out what groups already exist in an official capacity, talk to them. So social learning is one that I'll always wave the flag for. Make sure that you are speaking to other people and learning from other people. So going to any already established groups and asking them what the process was to be able to do this, and also making sure that you have a really strong case is the best way, especially in corporate environments. You really need to make sure that you have got like a very robust case as to why you think this should be an official ERG or ARG, and following that and then following the steps and advice. I'm a very like organized person, so I like to write out lots of to-do lists, lots of things that are structured, I would kind of gather all the information, learn from others first, learn what you need to present, and then plan out what you do from there.
Great. I love a good to-do list.
I'm a sucker for a to-do list.
Right? It's so helpful. I'm going to jump over to the Q&A tab here because we had a question about this idea of being uncomfortable, right? And getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So, and you talked about sort of making a safe environment for other folks to share and you being vulnerable. So if you could talk a little bit about your journey to get comfortable doing that, right? To get comfortable doing that kind of uncomfortable work and role modeling that for others.
I wouldn't say that I'm comfortable. I think this is like the tricky thing. I think there's like, if you're ever too comfortable, you're doing something wrong, in my opinion. You always have to put yourself in that uncomfortable position. But the only way that I got the courage to be uncomfortable is embodying those values that I was always taught. And because my mum, and I'm honestly not just saying this because she's my mum, but my mum is such a selfless person and she's always taught us to help other people. So like we have a family charity that we run, we have an orphanage in Ethiopia. Whenever there's anyone that needs help, if there are refugees that come into the country, if there is a charity bake sale, my mum is always the first person there. And so I've kind of just been raised in to put other people first and always want to help people. And so whenever I think to myself, oh my God, I am absolutely terrified. I cannot do this. I'm sweating. I'm shaking. I can't do this. I also think to myself, how many people can I benefit in this process? What can I do to help? How many people's lives can I impact? What can I do to change? If I don't put myself in this position, am I then blocking the path for other people to be able to come through? Other people who might not be as privileged as I am to be able to have this opportunity or put myself in this position. So I always think about others. I always think about the impact I can make. And that's what kind of pushes me towards that. And that's how I started my anti-racism community. I thought about what a world I can create for my younger sister. And that is what drove me to be able to make that change and put myself in that position.
I love that. That's such an excellent motivation. And I'm so glad you had such powerful role models from such an early age to be able to help instill that kind of comfort with discomfort within you or make you push through it, right? So that you can inspire other folks. Because I'm sure a lot of us don't necessarily grow up with that kind of strong of an influence. So now you get to be that role model for folks, maybe a little later in life than in their childhood in the workplace, right? But I'm sure that it's still making a really big impact on the folks that you work with, which is a huge number of people, right? I mean, how many folks are in the ARGs that you are involved in right now?
So we have like local ARGs. So in the UK, I think we have around 50 people, and then say another 50 in our diversability. We also have LGBTQ plus. We have generations. We have mental health. There's lots of ARGs, and then we have them globally. And so I also get the chance through my social learning community to work with the global ARGs as well. So we've got about 100 ARGs globally. So if we're talking between 50 to 100 people per ARG. It's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. And actually, that's a great transition to the question that Ken just shared, which is about silos within their company. So, we see this all of the time, right? Departments get really sort of isolated from one another. And it sounds like you have a lot of partnerships across both local and kind of global groups. So if you have any recommendations to help ensure that all of the people, sort of dispersed throughout an organization are engaged and included in this kind of work.
Yeah, I'm going to sound very Marzy right now, and I'm going to tell you networking is key. Networking is the biggest thing. So whoever you are, wherever you are, if you're in an office, if you are on a training course, network. Link up with them on LinkedIn as soon as you've finished. Speak to them, chat to them with out of that capacity that you are in and make those connections, because you never know where a person's going to go in their life. That person could go into a really high position in the company and could have more influence. And so through talking to people is how you get places. And that's how I get people to join the social learning community. I spend a lot of my day just chatting with people, understanding what they do, what they want to learn, how they want to learn. And that's how I spread the message of inclusivity in everything that I do. Even if I'm not talking about IND in particular, I always bring it into every conversation that I have. And that allows me to really span over a very wide area. And so if your departments are separating, which obviously does happen, especially in really big corporate environments, you've got to find a link. Now, a really great link is inclusivity, because it's something that we need in every walk of life, in at the back of our minds or at the front of our minds, in absolutely everything we do. So you just have to put yourself out there, network a lot, and talk to lots of people.
Great. Yeah. I mean, you can't sort of underestimate the value of those relationships with the different parts of, especially like you're saying with a big company, right? I would love to hear, just on that same note, a little bit more about your thoughts on the kind of overlaps or the importance of the relationship between learning and community, right? Because you're talking a lot about learning here, and I know you mentioned the social learning community, but how does sort of learning show up in a lot of your community work?
The thing is, every single community that I'm a part of, education is at the forefront of it. And I think that should be the case for literally every community. As human beings, we need to make sure that we're constantly learning and evolving to make the world a better place, to make us better people, to widen our horizons. There's so many different aspects of it. And so it's one of those things that is just inevitable within a community. Now, I personally am a big sucker for education. I love learning new things all the time. And so I try to bring that to every community I'm a part of. So, for example, my anti racism community, it's mainly about supporting making change. But the biggest part of that is education. You can't create positive change without understanding and learning first. So, a lot of people talk about allyship, for example. Within every community, you need to have allies. You need to be allies. But in order to be an effective ally, you have to have the education first. You can't just say, oh, yes, I'm an ally to the Black community without having a full understanding of their experiences and how they navigate the world. And that goes for every single type of thing outside of I&D as well. You have to have understanding first. And so education is at the pinnacle of everything that we do, including within our communities. And the best part about communities is that there's lots of different people from lots of different walks of life who can learn from each other. So that's where the social learning comes into absolutely everything that we do.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because, it's one thing to have a really thoughtful kind of explanation from one person about a given topic or a different sort of experience in the world, but to hear from lots of different people and sort of get different aspects of that on a continuous basis versus just in like a 1 hour workshop or something, it can make a huge, I think, difference for people really absorbing this kind of information. So Jesse wants to know how you get leaders to want to be a part of the change intentionally and not just sort of at a surface level.
I would say this is like a very ongoing and difficult difficult thing to tackle. I would say like it's still something that I struggle with. But one thing that I learned when I was putting in my senior leader training program was that the only way for me to get them to care is to use empathy. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? So it doesn't matter what we see on paper, what our job roles are, who we are. We all have empathy. Well, I should hope we all have empathy anyway. And so I knew that I had to use the power of empathy to get the message through and help people with understanding, because it's all good and well us having things like e-learnings, LinkedIn Learning, lots of different things like that. That gives us a surface level understanding of things. But if we want a much deeper level of understanding, and if we want our senior leaders to have that understanding, then you have to put yourself in that uncomfortable position of being vulnerable and sharing your story. And that's how I got a lot of senior leaders to care about inclusion and diversity, specifically when I'm talking about race and ethnicity. Or we have like reverse mentoring. So currently I'm reverse mentoring a senior leader on disability. So you have to put yourself in that position. And I tell the stories of my experiences all the time, very openly, which can be very scary, especially if you're sitting in front of like the general manager of the company and you're telling them about what happened to you last week at the shops. Like, it is absolutely terrifying. The whole thing is scary. But by using that and by putting myself in that vulnerable position, and there are always risks to these things, there's no denying that. But me being very open triggers their empathy and triggers them to care a lot more about the cause that I'm talking about. So I would say, like, try and get in a room with them and just talk to them. I think like we're so set these days on doing like structured like PowerPoint presentations and stuff like that. But I think, PowerPoints should be a crutch. We should be doing most of the learning, most of the educating, and most of the talking, because at the end of the day, we communicate better between ourselves as human beings rather than through email or through text or Teams or whatever you choose to use.
Yeah, that's such a, I mean, that's such a good point. And especially these days when there's so much remote, kind of interaction, right? To be able to just have a regular human conversation with somebody, I'm sure makes a huge difference in, kind of making this, the importance of kind of this type of work sink in for folks that are in those leadership positions. So we only have a couple of minutes left, but actually I would love to hear, Jesse noted that the reverse mentoring idea is very exciting. I'm also really excited about reverse mentoring and have been starting to do some research in that area. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that program, and especially it's kind of obvious how it benefits the leader who's being mentored, but how does it benefit you? How does it benefit the other people who are doing that reverse mentoring?
I mean, if I'm being totally transparent, it is not a perfect system at all. And the biggest failures of reverse mentoring is that the mentor doesn't get enough out of it. Now, for me, when I reverse mentor, it's because I know that I am paving the way for someone else, because you never know where that person will go, who they'll meet, what their experiences will be in life. They're going to encounter, like, for example, a disabled person at some point in their life, and how they treat them could be based on their understanding that I've taught them. And so for me, it's all about other people, but it's not as easy as that because it's incredibly emotionally draining, it's time consuming, and you don't get a lot out of it. So it's really important that when companies decide to implement reverse mentoring, that there is some sort of incentive or something to come out of it for the person who is mentoring, because I think we have a very bad habit in corporate environments of taking advantage of people and expecting them to do the work just because they belong to that group. Whereas that's not the case. We should all have incentives or be rewarded for the work that we're doing. So make sure that if you are implementing a reverse mentoring program, that you have some sort of incentive or reward and recognition for all of the work that the mentor is doing, because people don't truly realize the work that goes into the whole process.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because we do see that come up in community management as well, right? A lot of folks are sort of volunteering their extra time on top of their full-time work to be able to lead these communities without being paid, without being recognized by the company for that work. And I could see how that would be then compounded in something like a reverse mentoring program, right? Have you found any particular incentives in at Mars to be helpful, like sort of time incentives, monetary incentives, things like that to be helpful for folks?
We're still trying to work out what the best way to do it is, because Mars is such a huge, huge company. There's no like easy way of answering this. For example, who I'm mentoring doesn't live in the same country as me, is a very much further job level than me. It's very different. But also, if you're mentoring a considerably more senior leader than yourself, the networking and the visibility aspect is a really big pull for you, for me as an individual as well. I would say, like, I don't have the answers, if I'm being totally honest, but I think like it depends on the company. It depends on how big you are, budget, stuff like that. But I would say, like, people always think that budgets can be pushed. Make sure that you are pushing your budgets for the things that matter, and inclusion and diversity is one of the things that matter, that people should definitely be pushing budgets for a lot more than they are now. So I'll leave it at that.
That is excellent. That's an excellent note to end on. And thank you so much, Karima, for talking to us today and for sharing your responses to these questions, and your talk in the first place. The last question that did come in was about sort of balancing, I think, inclusivity and exclusivity in these kinds of communities, right? And figuring out how to, I think, best leverage that kind of work for the benefit of everybody. And thank you so much for doing all of that hard work inside of Mars and for sharing it with us.
Thank you for having me.